Ladies and gentlemen, this is a belated Christmas present from yours truly back to Warcraft to the community. In the past couple of weeks, we talked a lot about balance because our PTR patch is coming up, or is up. The new balance patch for Warcraft 3 is coming up, and we talk a lot about it. But we might know a bit about Warcraft 3, but we don't know anything about game design, about balancing. We might have a gut feeling, but we have no professional opinion or anything. So I thought, who could I talk to? Who has some experience with games and creating stuff and balancing? And all of a sudden, this handsome young man from California slid into my DMs, said, hey, Neo, want to talk balance? And that's what we're doing. Kevin Monk Dong is back from Frost Giant, working on Stormgate, former Blizzard employee. Welcome to the show, and thank you for your time.
Excited to talk about gameplay balance, which is something that I'm personally very passionate about. I grew up with watching Starcraft 1 streams, watching Warcraft 3 streams, watching competitive Starcraft 2 for most of my life. And now I'm very lucky to be in a position where I actually get to affect those games and like change the games that I used to love.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting, right? So you started as a viewer and fan, then you joined Blizzard and you were working on games that other people created, right? You weren't there when Starcraft 2 was created, if I remember correctly?
No, I was not. I joined the Starcraft 2 team about 5 years ago. Just talking a bit about my history and my work. I primarily worked on what was called the co-op commanders feature of Starcraft 2, which was a cooperative mode in which you and an ally play in campaign-style missions. And they were very replayable, very fun. Actually, Starcraft 2's most popular mode at the time. However, I also worked on gameplay balance for Starcraft 2, and right before I left, I ended up leading the Starcraft 2 balance team at the end of 2020. I also helped work on Warcraft 3 balance when they needed extra people. So I was part of the Warcraft 3 balance team in the years between 2019 and 2020.
Ooh, wasn't that the Keeper and Cryptlore times? Does that add to your credibility now?
I think I started around when the Cryptlord times, but after the Keeper times.
Okay.
And right now I'm working on Stormgate, of course, creating a new RTS. I primarily currently work on designing things such as the resources, the units, and the gameplay interactions. And in the future, I'll also be focused on balance for Stormgate as well.
So is it more comfortable or less comfortable for you to create something entirely new? It must be more challenging, I guess, but it's also yours and you can create it from the ground up.
Yeah, it's definitely two different skill sets. I think jumping in as a new designer, it was definitely more comfortable to create to tweak something that was already made. Oftentimes when there are already things created and you just have to tweak the parameters, because it is restrictive in terms of design, it allows you to ironically be even more creative and allows you to work within like a very comfortable sandbox. However, the other side of it is like you have to kind of figure out the intentions of the original designers. And in my mind, and we can get into this a lot, like I had to figure out, do I want to keep the intention of the original designers or do I want to move in my own direction and potentially like go against that original design?
So before we go into the nitty gritty and explain balance to the people and how to approach balance, do you want to leak the Stormgate beta date?
Stormgate beta will be launched in sometime next year in 2023. But I'm here more to talk about RTS game design in general, I would say.
Yes. Okay. So a lot of people might watch our casts and know a little bit of Warcraft, but if we talk about balance, what do you understand under the term of balance? Let's start at the very foundation of balancing.
Yeah, so I think this is actually a very controversial topic, even within like game design itself. And what a balance designer does, and what the purpose of a balance designer is very controversial. So I would say maybe like 10, 20 years ago, the predominant thinking behind what is balance is essentially everything wins 50% of the time. It's a very statistics-based discipline, and you just got to make sure everything is fair. And I think the more modern sentiment, and one I personally subscribe to, is how I like to think of it is game balance design is kind of a subset of game design, and the purposes of games is to have fun, is to ensure that the player has fun. So within the context of balance design, how can we tweak balance such that we maximize fun for players? And what often that comes down to is not necessarily the numbers themselves being 50-50, everything's perfectly even, but rather the perception of balance is even. And I guess what that means is players are having fun because they perceive that the game is fair, and they perceive that the decisions they're making are important, they're interesting, and everyone is just having a good time rather than, happy is winning like 25% of the games rather than 90% of the games.
Yeah, that's true. I think example for the first philosophy would be rock, paper, scissors, right? Because all the three things have the same win rate and a counter and a weakness, etc. But if you play 200 games of rock, paper, scissors in a row, it's not that exciting anymore.
Yeah, that's a great example and one that I very commonly use. Some other examples are taking an example from Starcraft 2. There was the meta of Terran versus Protoss, where technically the win rates for that matchup was 50-50, but Terran often felt like they had to win in the early game. Terran often was thought of as the early game race, and Protoss was the late game race. And for Terran, even though it was a 50-50 matchup, it was often unfun because they felt a time crunch in order to win the game as early as possible. So there's always this stress of I have to do this much damage, I have to do this much damage, I have to do this much damage. And like as the game got further and further along, they began to feel more and more hopeless. And speaking of that, one thing we learned on the StarCraft 2 team is that late game balance, especially within the context of StarCraft 2, disproportionately affects players' perception of how balanced a game is. So, for example, if Terran is actually a 51-49 race, they're winning 51% of the time, but their extreme late game is weaker than Protoss's. They often feel like they are winning a lower percentage of the time, and they feel worse relative to even if it was a more quote unquote balanced matchup at 50-50.
Huh. That's interesting. I think in Warcraft it's the exact opposite. If you believe it or not, the pro win rate between human and undead is also basically 50-50. It's one of the most fair matchups we have, according to Helpstone statistics, which I trust quite a bit. And here it feels like human are just suffering for 20 minutes, and then their game begins. And everybody, I mean, we have an amplifier on human is too weak, but the scene as a whole also perceives human as too weak, especially in that matchup.
Yeah, I think one thing that we'll get into later on is like every game is different.
Yeah.
And this perception of fairness and this perception of fun actually not only depends on like the core mechanics of the game itself, but the community that is built around the game. So how I would balance Warcraft 3 is completely different from how I would balance Starcraft 2, even though there are very similar games, just because of the community and the history that is involved between these two games.
Interesting. So there is, I guess, there must be a philosophy. You talked about yours. Is there in your team maybe a different philosophy than what you have, or was there a different philosophy at Blizzard? I guess the question is, who do we balance for? Is it for fun? Is it for the statistics? Is it for the pro players? Is it for the average Joe? Who do we balance for?
Yeah, I would say again, this depends on the community itself. I'll first talk about it from like the StarCraft perspective. From the StarCraft 2 perspective, I would say StarCraft 2 was a game that was even more competitively dominated than Warcraft 3. I think the average player looked at StarCraft 2 pro play and was like, this is the pinnacle of balance, and this is who we should be balancing towards. And also, based on how those games went, players' perception of balance would change. So, for example, if a Terran player won the GSL finals, the sentiment would shift towards more Terran is OP, right? So I think in StarCraft 2, we specifically did aim to balance for a very high level of competition because StarCraft was marketed as such a competitive focused game. I would say, again, even more so than Warcraft 3. However, that does not mean, and I think this is a misconception within even the StarCraft community, that does not mean that we did not balance towards lower level players. And how we balance towards lower level players is often when a strategy becomes more difficult to defend than to execute, then we kind of we kind of tweaked those numbers. So for example, there was a strategy called a Widow Mine Drop in the early days of the second expansion of StarCraft 2 that was much easier to execute than to defend. It had a lot of other consequences, such as games often ended very quickly, but at the pro level, this was not necessarily a huge problem because the pro players had the execution required to defend a Widow Mine Drop that was potentially game ending. But at a mid level, even like a mid masters level, which I would say is like about 17, 1800 in War 3 Champions, that even at that level, which is very high, it was like the top like 5% of players, it was very difficult to defend. So that strategy was changed. And was balanced around, it was changed because of mid-level play. And I would say an analogous situation currently in Warcraft 3 is kind of one of the problems with headhunters is that it's a relatively easy strategy to execute, especially versus undead, compared to how easy it is to defend against headhunters. I know, Neo, you have a lot of experience with this, judging from your previous stream games earlier today as well.
Ha ha
So the
ha.
so like again, like at the pro level, maybe headhunters aren't that OP against undead, but I think the average player really struggles with headhunters and just being this unit that can A move and requires a lot of micro from the undead player in order to beat. So I guess those are two kind of the two angles. Do we so the real answer is we do balance for both pro play and mid-level play, and we kind of take a look at these situations a little differently.
Okay, so you're kind of aiming at a sweet spot between fun and fairness, if I got that right.
I would say fairness is very directly related to fun. Um,
Yeah.
how how fair you perceive a game to be directly impacts how fun it is. So again, in StarCraft 2, we probably made 99% of balance changes um, for the competitive minded players
Okay.
to balance at the pro level, but there was maybe 1 or 2% of changes that was balanced towards more of the mid tier or lower tier level. Some other changes we did, for example, are we gave the High Templar an attack. It used to be that one of the casters in StarCraft 2 could not attack, and what players would do is A move that unit and send it off to its death. And giving an attack has no impact whatsoever for pro level play, but it helps lower level players and it balances out so lower level Protoss players can actually use this high skill unit. In Warcraft 3, I'm not exactly sure what percentage of changes should be geared towards pro level play versus mid level play, but I think we do need to consider um, both these tiers for a healthy community.
How do you make such decisions, and who makes these decisions?
I would say uh, how you would make this decision is you analyze the community and you analyze like the actual people playing the game. Um, are the people playing the game more casually minded? So maybe like a Candy Crush, for instance, or a game that is less focused on the esport aspect of it and more focused on casual players. And for those kind of games, I think I would try to aim more of my changes towards that level of play versus a more like esports focused game, like a StarCraft 2, like a Warcraft 3. I would aim it towards a pro level of play. An interesting thing that happened, for example, in Heroes of the Storm is that um, Heroes of the Storm actually had a huge problem with this, where balancing around esports caused the average player experience to be less fulfilling. And I'm not super familiar with Heroes of the Storm, but from what I hear, after HGC was disbanded and after the focus was more less so on competitive play, uh, gameplay balance could be more done at the average level of play for solo queue, for instance, and players actually overall the community enjoyed that game a lot more after the balancing philosophy has shifted. In terms of who is making that decision of what to balance, I think it is just the game balance team. They have to sit down, come together with a cohesive philosophy, and use that as their like kind of their guiding light as to say, why are we making the changes we're making?
Yeah, that's interesting because in the Warcraft scene, of course, we don't know who does the balance, and we don't know if it's a team or if it's one person. But whenever we do feedback for the proposed changes, it's always just one person. So I can tell my changes, and Remo has a very different opinion, of course, but we don't really talk towards each other to find a middle ground and have one philosophy. So you can't cherry pick, right? You need a combined philosophy as a team.
Well, yeah, you need a singular philosophy as a team, or else you just get changes that like some of the changes do that, and sometimes some of the changes are going in the other direction. And I think one reality about game balance is that I think on a big game such as a League of Legends, for example, you often have multiple balance designers, and you often have multiple people in quality assurance who are able to play at a very high level and who are able to like kind of test out any changes. So the first thing I want to dispel is that generally people who work on games are not good at the games that they work on. And I would say this is becoming less and less true, but let's say like 10 years ago, like no one who worked on like any game or generally is going to be at like a tippy top level, and they won't be able to like emulate the play styles of professional players. However, because esports has gotten more and more prominent, I think you're seeing a lot more like competitively minded people being recruited into gameplay balance. And you're also seeing a lot more people from communities being recruited onto game teams. The second thing is that relative to the size of the game, the size of the game balance team is going to differ. So for League of Legends, you might have like 4 or 5 people who are competitively minded. Similar for like a game like for like Hearthstone, for instance. However, when you get to more niche games, even Starcraft or Warcraft 3, the number of people who are working on game balance at any one time could be 1, or it could be a half, it could be a third. You often have people who are juggling multiple roles, and only a small subset of their responsibilities is going to be game balance. So when you have that happening, it's really hard to hire for that kind of person, right? Because not only do they have to be relatively competent at the game, but they have to understand all these other aspects of the game. Another thing I wanted to spell is like, I think I think for the average player, it's very nebulous as to how a game is made.
Yeah.
And the average player might think, oh, game designers are actually maybe like half the company. When in reality, like I'm a game designer, for instance, and I focus on balance, but I'm maybe like 1/30th or 1/50th percentage of the company, or 1/50th of the company. So like relative to the like, I think game balance very much impacts the average game player's experience, but it's a very small subset of like what it takes to make a game.
It's probably also because it's really hard to find a consensus among game designers. So it's better if it's one really skilled guy or 3 really skilled guys who get along very well, instead of like 15 people who all try to punch in their own vision.
Yeah, I would say generally there should be one general vision, and the team has to come together to agree to what that vision is.
Mm-hmm.
But on a team, you're never going to have like people who agree or who all agree on a singular topic, and I don't think that's actually a good idea, because why would you have multiple people if they're all going to agree on within a given team anyway, right? So one thing we actually did on the Starcraft 2 team is, even though we didn't have that many balance designers, we were able to leverage the community with and the pro players specifically in order to help us balance, which is like a whole another topic altogether.
What a professional segue to the next topic, man. I was about to ask, how do you, like, let's say the game designers sat at home or at the office, and they came up with what they want to release, like what we have as a PTR patch now. And then they publish it to the world, and the Battle.net forums are going wild. You get feedback from all over the place. The content creators are doing their videos. The average Joe is posting on Reddit and, of course, the forums, and it's on social media. How do you gather feedback, and how do you filter bad feedback from good feedback?
That's a great question. So I want to step back a bit. You got to the part where you've already posted the changes and you're soliciting feedback from the community. I want to talk first about like what we eventually did on Starcraft 2.
Mm-hmm.
So on Starcraft 2, the process was, hey, like the community's like complaining about a bunch of stuff, or we're watching as game designers, we're watching the games ourselves, and we're like, hey, this seems like a little problematic. So number one, we as game designers, we have theories about what the problems are. And we write them down, for instance. So some theories might be like, oh, orc versus undead is looking a little like disfavored towards one matchup or the other, and we write down, hey, maybe it's because of this, maybe it's because of that. Then we have like pretty strong like back channels with professional players. So we are able to directly talk to those players in a one-on-one setting, and we have conversations with those players. So one thing is like we're saying, hey, what do you feel? We start by asking, hey, what do you feel like are the problematic matchups? How do you feel is the game flow of these matchups on an average basis? And what do you perceive as the problems of that matchup? So sometimes we'll get like feedback as orc is too strong, right? And if we hear like orc is too strong, for example, like we kind of ask more pointed questions. What part of orc is strong is like a question I would ask. Is it the early game? Is it the mid game? Is it the late game? And then we would just keep like digging down deep, and then we would get a question of like, hey, the early game pressure is too high from orc in the early game. So then we would ask, hey, what's strong about the early game pressure? Is it the fact that like farseers can summon wolves over and over again? Is it the fact that like headhunters can reinforce too quickly? And with that information, we can come back with a solid understanding of the problems involved. We'd be able to come up with solutions. So often what we would do is we would come up with like maybe 5 solutions to this potential problem, and then debate within the team from a balance perspective, does this solve the problem? And also from a game design perspective, is this a good solution? Does this make the game better? Often we would actually ask pros, hey, what do you think would be good changes? And I think you know this, Neo. Pros are not often the best players to solicit like actual balance changes from. But I think one thing it does do is it kind of gets into the mind of the pros, in that based on the changes that they come up with, you can kind of more delve into what they think the problem is. So it's a way of like, if the pros aren't particularly good at communicating, for instance, it's a way of like figuring out, hey, they think this area of this problem needs to be changed. So maybe we can focus on this area. It just gives us a better idea. So once we do that, once we have like a good host of solutions to all the problems that generally the pros have proposed, then we go back to them sometimes, often on a one-to-one basis, with these solutions. Once we're comfortable with the solutions that we have, we actually send out an email, a feedback survey. It's usually like an Excel sheet where we list out like all the potential changes, and we ask the players, hey, do you agree with this or do you not agree with this? And we put out the reasonings in the Excel sheet for why we want to do this. And then the players have a field in which they can say, why do we like this or why do we not like this? Once all those feedback surveys come in, we kind of shorten that list down, and we write a community post about, well, first of all, we implement the changes, we test the changes that we narrowed it down to. We write a community post about why we did all of why we picked the changes that we did. We send it out, we make a PTR, and then then it becomes public, and then we get feedback from the broader community, and we hear a lot of arguments from the broader community. And based on those arguments, and based on how the meta has been shaping up in this very lengthy process, which can often take up to a month, then we like iterate on the patch notes again, and then we send it out. Often we have like 3 or 4 PTR periods before we actually push the changes out into live. So yeah, that's the general strategy that we used in StarCraft 2 and what I plan to use in Stormgate as well.
That sounds really good. It sounds really annoying from your perspective to dig for the answers that you want to get. And I guess we all hope that pro players would be a little more proactive in the communicating. But yeah, most of the time you get the human is OP answer. But when we look at the Warcraft changes the past few years, there was always something that seemed way too strong from the very beginning. For example, the Crypt Lord, for example, the Keeper, maybe now mirror image or even immolation. Is that something that a game designer uses as a pusher change, for example, to give an incentive to try a hero that wasn't used for a super long time, for example?
Yeah, I would say generally, when you put out changes and you especially when you buff something that was extremely underused in the past, it's a good philosophy to kind of over buff it in a way so that you encourage players to use it. Because even in the Warcraft community, you like I think it's actually a very slow developing meta relative to other games, in that people find out like new innovations all the time, maybe a year after the patches happened.
It's
So for
exactly the point I
example,
was making as well, yeah.
yeah, exactly. For example, like the ghoul meta, like against all
Yeah.
races, is like a very recent thing, and it's always existed. There haven't been any patch changes, but players are just discovering, hey, maybe we can use ghouls. Maybe we can use maybe you can actually expand with a lich, for instance.
Yeah.
However, I will temper that with saying that like when you overbuff something and you consciously overbuff something, ideally you would want to be able to change things at a later date if it becomes too strong.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I think that's what you saw with the Keeper meta, with the Crypt Lord meta. One thing I will say is like during that era of changes, it's kind of like competing philosophies. We do want to try to overbuff things to try to get players to use them, but at the same time, I think the team was conscious that because it was a rather small team, they were not able to patch as often as they would have liked. So the question then becomes, do I want to overbuff these things? Do I want to encourage players to use them, or do I want to maintain more of like stability? And do I want to make sure things are not super overbalanced?
Yeah.
So it becomes like a push pull there. And honestly, like there's not like the correct answer of what to do in that situation. And it's just you do the best you can with the limited resources that you can, and you can have to try to eyeball things the best you can.
Yeah, sometimes you're lucky and it's working out, and sometimes yeah, you miss, I guess. An example would be the Blade Master mirror image at the moment. On the first iteration, it was like 10% damage, and everybody said it's not going to make a difference, like 3 damage per hit or something. Now it's at 25, and everybody deems it as too strong. And we hopefully get a third iteration of the PTR. Maybe they hit the nail perfectly or not, but at least with the second iteration, they gave people a reason to try out the mirror image, and it's not going to be revealed 1 year later that it's really, really, really good.
I think Blizzard is actually doing like a pretty good job about consistently coming out with these PTR patches. I think they are showing that they are listening to the community,
Yes.
and that they are like iterating and they're like trying out new things.
Yeah.
And that's really helped by the community tournaments that you're running, Neo. Back at Blizzard, we actually this might hurt a bit, but back at Blizzard, we actually paid tournament organizers to like host tournaments on the PTR that we would put out. And we would encourage like they would get like a prize pool, and like they would get paid to like for their time, and like the tournament organizers would be responsible for inviting players for these essentially show matches for the community. I don't know if you're familiar with Wardy, but Wardy usually ran those tournaments.
Wardy is great, of course. And Mr. Blizzard, you owe me $150 for the PTR tournament we ran a week ago.
Maybe. Yeah, but there definitely are a lot of challenges with Warcraft 3 that didn't necessarily exist in Starcraft 2. Like the whole balance process I described is very challenging in Warcraft 3. for a couple of reasons. And I think the primary reason is probably the relationship between Blizzard and the community itself.
What
I know
relationship?
back on I know back on when I was working on when I was helping with balance on the Warcraft 3 team, we actually did try to implement some semblance of that process that I described. However, when we tried to like solicit feedback from pro players through DreamHack, basically we like wanted to send out a survey and we wanted to see what pro players thought of the survey. The pro players actually refused to fill out the survey in protest of like what happened with Reforged and all.
Well, maybe to defend the pro players a little bit. This is something I do rarely, but in this case, I think I have to. This was done by other people at Blizzard before. So when you asked, it was like the 5th time somebody reached out, I guess. And they never gave an answer. It was just, hey, give me suggestions, give me something to work on, and never a dialogue at all. So at the 5th time, I can definitely understand the players to just like, okay, this is another new team. This is another new person asking me. They will never answer again. I can understand them for saying, screw you guys.
Yeah, I think that's always going to be the problem going forward, because I think the individual people working at Blizzard, they actually do, like, a lot of them do want to make the game better. But it's really hard because I think as a Blizzard employee working on Reforged, you kind of have to like tiptoe around a bit because of the delicate relationship between the company and the community itself. So there's a lot of things just based on the fact that you are working on Reforged that you don't have the freedom to do compared to if you're working on like a product which the community is very happy about, and or like a new product, for example, like Stormgate. So I do want to give like a lot of I do want to like say like I think the people working at Blizzard right now have a really difficult time, and I believe they are trying to like do the best with the restrictions they have right now.
Yeah, this was a couple of minutes ago, but I think this is interesting for the plebs like me and the people in the chat. You talked about resources. So from our perspective, it could be so easy. Headhunters are overpowered, just do a value change in the editor and push it live. But you tell me something about resources. So what would prevent a team from doing more frequent balance updates?
I would say it's just, so in order to do a balanced update, it actually takes like, so number one, Warcraft 3 is somewhat difficult to change because a lot of the abilities in the game are hard-coded in code rather than a simple data change. So some changes like increase the damage of a unit, those are relatively easy. But any like complete reworks, like ability Y does a new effect, for instance. You have to go into the C++ in order to actually change that ability. And in order to do that, you need to borrow time from an engineer, which is more valuable than just a designer making a simple data change. In addition, the resources required to actually push out a balance patch is rather substantial. In order to like make any one change to the game is very substantial. So for example, if I wanted to push out a patch that just increases or decreases headhunter damage by 1, right? That is about like about the same amount of effort as making a balance change, about making like 20 balance changes, for instance, to the live services team. So need to borrow resources from either the Reforged team or the other teams, and in order to justify pushing out a patch, you need to have a very good reason. It needs to be justified why you're doing what you're doing.
All right, so it's human resources, which is basically what costs, right?
Yeah, human resources cost is a big one.
Yeah. All right. Where did we end off before I asked about resources?
Reforged community.
Oh yeah, Reforged community, exactly. Yeah. So if then you said you did the surveys with the pro players, so this seemed to be your number one thing because they know the game the best, but they're also like they are biased, so it's not absolute what they say. Do you listen to the forums at all, to the people without a big name who didn't win a DreamHack, who is not Grandmaster on the ladder?
Of course. Well, I don't want to say of course, but I think the amount that we listen to the average player is like directly correlated with the ability they have to communicate the changes that they are suggesting. So if they are well reasoned out changes and like basically everything what they are saying is logical and it makes sense, then we give a high amount of credence to those players. So I think from the Blizzard perspective, if Remo puts out a patch and he explains his reasoning on a stream, like the reason that Blizzard listens to someone like Remo is not necessarily because he is a big name in the community, but because he takes the effort to actually think about what is like currently wrong with the game, what are changes that you could do to help make the game better, and he explains all the reasoning out in a logical manner. So you might not agree with the changes, but I think any average player who wants to make an impact on the game can just do that process themselves. And I think honestly, Blizzard would listen to that equally as much. So, for example, Cephid is someone who did exactly that on the Warcraft3 Reddit. Cephid is kind of a big name in the community in that he works for W3 Champions, but I think from like Blizzard might not know that. Blizzard might say, oh, he's just an average Reddit user. And Cephid posted his changes, and a lot of them were adapted onto the Warcraft 3 patch notes. Something I will say is that I think one advantage that Starcraft has over Warcraft 3 is that because Blizzard has been fairly communicative to the Starcraft community, Starcraft 2 community over the past 10 years, the Starcraft 2 community, both the pro players and the average players, are actually more intuitively better at communicating reasoning behind changes. So, for example, the Starcraft 2 community always had balance changes accompanied by reasonings, and based on those reasonings, the Starcraft community together kind of learned how to make balance changes. And actually for me, like before I joined the Starcraft 2 team, that was a large part of how I learned how a professional game company does game design, and I learned a lot of lessons just from reading those patch notes. Another thing is that because the pro players are familiar with communicating with Blizzard game designers on a regular basis, I think I've noticed even over my like 3 years at Blizzard that they have consistently gotten better at number one, giving feedback, and number two, proposing balance changes. And you find that a lot of like the best players at this actually give changes to they kind of play the politics a bit in some ways, in that they actually suggest ways to nerf their own race so that they sound more credible when they're suggesting buffs later on.
Yep. Yeah, I can definitely see that. Unfortunately for us in the Warcraft scene, it's mostly like there's no reasoning given from neither the players nor Blizzard. Like they did that during the Reforged era, I think. But now there's no comments onto why they do the lumber increase for the Headhunter, for example. We take the Headhunter as example, but it's just a good example because the entire scene, I think, is of the opinion that the lumber change is bad, but even on the second PTR iteration, they keep this lumber change. So I would really love to know why they are exactly changing this. I think it's because during the Reforged era, they lost a bit of credibility when they did the comments, because some of these comments weren't really hitting the problem of the unit, and made us as the community feel like, okay, they are vaguely aware of the problem, but not really.
I think it's even more simple than that. I think a large part of it is the resources required to write those comments. It actually does take a while, and not only that, back when I was working at Blizzard, you had to localize all the changes, which means you had to you had to PR edit the changes, and then you had to localize the changes, or the reasonings rather, and that often had a week-long turnaround, because you had to talk to your PR team, you had to get an editor to edit your patch notes or your reasonings, for instance, and then you have to go through the localization team who distributes it to the local localizers, and then everything has to get pushed out at the same time. So yeah, it's a combination of like I think, and also maybe like the people who are working there are not as like strong in like writing like those kind of notes, for instance. So it's a combination of like all of those things that I think is the reason we no longer have those reasonings or rationales.
All right. If you're listening, Blizzard, I would love them back. If you need help writing them, let me know. So I think we talked about human feedback. How do you treat statistics? Is that a metric at all? If so, what are good statistics and what are bad statistics?
I think so. I think the amount that you use statistics is dependent on two things. Number one, do you have statistics? So on larger games, we had this thing called like telemetry, which is basically you read data from like all the games that are ever played on your game, and you figure out like, hey, A unit is getting used more, B unit is getting used more. And the second thing, so number one, availability of those statistics, and B, I think a lot of it depends on the game that you're working on. So for example, like a Hearthstone kind of game where there are 9 different classes and you can see the play rates of all the classes and you can see the like the play rates of the individual cards. You can see how often the cards win when they're played. You can see how often the cards win when they are drawn. There's a lot of statistics you can get into. I think for games like that and games like MOBAs where there are multiple characters to choose from, there are multiple skill paths and very discrete skill paths in the sense that, hey, at level 1, players choose this skill, and when they choose skill A, they win X% of the time versus when they choose Y skill at level 7, they win that percentage of the time. I think those statistics are very useful. I think for an RTS where there is only 3 or 4 factions and the number of choices is in some ways more discrete, I think it is less useful. And I think what is more useful is the feeling of the players and how the games actually play out. I know we have a lot of people in the Warcraft community like Helpstone who come up with great statistics about like how matchups are affected based on the MMR. And I think those are really helpful. I think that's actually one of the most helpful statistics in understanding game balance. But in terms of like the actual, like I build 5 headhunters and therefore I win, or I build 6 hunters and therefore I win, I think that is less useful from an RTS perspective. And I think that the feeling of it itself is more important.
So, for example, on the War3 Champions homepage, we got statistics telling us the win rate per game mode and per league, basically. So is that useful or not?
I think you have to approach it with like an understanding of what those statistics actually mean. One of my favorite examples is back when I was on StarCraft2, there was a website called Eligulac, which is kind of like an MMR aggregator of like based on the pro matches from StarCraft 2 players. And they had this metric called leading race and lagging race, and players always misunderstood what that meant. What Eligulac meant is it basically averaged the top 5 players of every race. And what would happen is because like Maru and Cyril were so dominant, like those two would always be the leading races, and you would never have Protoss being the leading race because just of the highest echelon of skill, like these 2 players were the big outliers.
For the
So that's
Warcraft
an example
community,
of,
this is happy in 1.2.0 as Undead at the moment, basically.
yeah, totally. And that's like a whole other topic I could go into is like another challenge of balancing Warcraft 3 is that in reality, the game only has these like 2 players per race that can actually compete at the highest level. So what does like a balanced human versus undead matchup look like? Does that mean like Chimiko is beating Happy 50% of the time? Or like what does that really mean, right? And I think that's part of what like Helpstone's article really helps elucidate in that you don't want to balance it, even if you're balancing at the top B level, you don't want to balance it in strictly in terms of undead versus human is 50% at the pro player level, but rather that based relative to their respective MMRs, the matchup is balanced. And what that might look like is like human is winning 30 or 40% of the time versus undead at the top pro level.
Yeah. Thanks, for confirming that. I think we talked a bit about that in private, and just dropping win rates, guys. It's not the way. It's not the way. It's easy to dig them up. I get that. It's easy to quote them, but it's not the way because player skill is a thing. That's maybe another question. Is that a thing among you game designers that you, let's say, human is super weak in Warcraft right now, right? Everybody knows. So you see this problem, but you also realize that, and that is now theoretical, I don't want to be too brave here, the human players are just worse than the undead players. So is that something you discuss?
I think that's definitely something we do think about. And the end solution from the StarCraft 2 perspective, in which this actually was a problem, but not nearly to the degree of Warcraft 3, is that we are trying to balance not only for like the finals of a tournament, but also like the top 4 and the top 8 and the top 16 and the top 32. The problem with Warcraft is it doesn't actually go that deep in that like the top 32 players aren't really like nearly as competitive as the top 32 players in StarCraft. So from that perspective, I think what we have to do is like look at each matchup. It's less about balancing the races and more about balancing the matchups, and look at how each matchup in actuality plays out, and where are the unfun parts, for instance, or what are the specifically unfair parts. Yeah, so a lot of it is like not looking at balancing races overall, but balancing, like, for example, the human versus undead matchup, and specific aspects of the human versus undead matchup.
Okay, so my takeaway from this is pie charts by prominent community figures are meaningless. Good. So you wanted to talk about specific challenges when balancing Reforged. You talked about the player base already, and that a lot of stuff has to be written in C# or whatever, or whatever the language is. I don't know. Is that what you wanted to talk about, or is there more? What makes it so hard to balance Warcraft?
Yeah, I think the challenges, like specifically with Warcraft, is the relatively skewed pro player base, like that we just talked about. The inability for Blizzard to directly communicate with players, or even with like community members. I think that is actually one of the biggest factors, because I don't think we would have been able to do nearly as good of a job on StarCraft 2 if we did not have pro players acting as like acting as help with both design feedback and like balance feedback. Another thing I wanted to talk about is like oftentimes like we would put out these community patches. We would come out with these like community updates just to explain our understanding of the state of the game. So for instance, there was a time period in StarCraft 2 where we actually could not patch due to technical limitations. And we had not patched for like 3 or 4 months, right? So what we actually did was we put out a community update with like, these are the problems that we think are happening right now, and these are some of our potential solutions that we might implement in the future. And what we discovered is like, we didn't change anything about the game, but the community somehow became much, much, much less toxic, just because they heard that like, hey, Blizzard was listening, and like there would be changes coming up. And we were only able to do that with the help of the talking like under NDA with pro players, to help understand the state of the game. Another thing we did with these community updates is we were able to shift the narrative in a lot of ways.
Yes.
So for example, at one point in the StarCraft 2 time span, the community sentiment was that Zerg was favored over Protoss in the late game. But having talked to a lot of Zerg players and Protoss players, we actually got feedback of that it was either an even matchup or actually Protoss was favored. So we communicated that in a community update, and how we framed it was like, we didn't say, hey, we think Protoss versus Zerg is Protoss favored, right? Because then we would get laughed at. But we framed it as like, hey, having spoken to prominent Protoss and Zerg players, the feedback that we're getting is that Protoss is actually even or favored against Zerg in the late game. And we were actually able to shift the narrative there. and that even though the player perception still was that Zerg was favored over Protoss, it was because of a different reason. So we were able to shift the thinking of the entire community towards that other reason, which was that I think it was like at the time creep was too good and banelings were too good, but late game actually Protoss was favored, and the reason the community thought that Zerg was favored is that Protoss was actually getting into the late game consistently at a disadvantage, and therefore they were not able to play on an evil footing into the late game. But those are just some examples of things. Number one, I just wanted to say, I think communication with the community is important. And it is often like the hope of balance patches is often more important than the actual
Yes.
balance patches itself, is what we learned. And number two,
before you go to number two, just want to like make one point. The way you describe it, like we talked to the pro players, it's so simple, but it shows two things. Like you don't think of the game devs as being the end all be all and that you know it all, and you show that you're in touch with the community. That's two great things that you show to a community with just one sentence. So pretty smart in that regard. Please go ahead.
And then number two, I guess like we would not have been able to do any of this without the pro player feedback. So it is actually like the balancing aspect of the game is actually like a team effort more than that of like the company itself or like the balance designers themselves.
Yeah,
so kind of reiterating what you just said.
Yeah, yeah. I wish we had the same here, because we do have a lot of smart players that would like to contribute, but there is no open channel apparently. But yeah, I also want to reiterate what you said. There've been quite some month where there was no communication at all, and the longer these silences go, the louder the dead game people become. Like they will never do anything, to a degree where a lot of people were asking that we do the balance ourselves, whether it's us or War3 Champions or whatever. Just we all thought that the game has been abandoned, as we've been abandoned a couple of times before. And then this one patch came that introduced the ladder, and there's like two possible narratives. The easy way is to jump on them again and say, oh, it's redundant, we have a ladder already, screw you guys. Or you pick it as a good sign and try to spread some positivity within the scene. Like, okay, they want to do something good, they want to do a cleanup, let's spin it that way. And so I guess what I want to say is the longer the break from the team to the community, the more toxic it gets. And that's just pretty, I can understand that, but it's also up to the community itself to know how to treat news, whether they're great or not.
Yeah, it's something that it's a really difficult issue, because like I think the community is where it is because it is a rough situation, like no one is happy with the situation, and like it's hard to say, hey, you guys, like as a community, we have to be more mature, we have to like take it, we have to like deal with the situation in like a respectable manner. But like the reality of the situation is like people are mad, and like they deservingly are mad, and I don't really know how to change that or how to fix that. So I do think the best results can be achieved if the community works together, like with Blizzard, and works together with all parties involved. But it's really hard to say to an individual person who has real feelings and real emotions that like, hey, this is like what you need to do.
Yeah, I think the changes from PTR 1 to PTR 2 was the best communication we had in years, because they listened to us. That was very obvious that they did, and they didn't say that in any way or through Twitter or whatever, but it was clearly visible by their action, and that's something I can work with. That was cool. So if they continue this path, I'm a happy man.
Yeah, I'm actually pretty happy at myself with like the turnaround, and like generally the changes. Like I obviously don't agree with all of them from a game design perspective, but yeah, I think it's a pretty solid direction overall.
So going back to balancing Warcraft a little bit, how much of a difference does it make that it's 4 races compared to 3 in StarCraft, plus the neutral heroes and units? So it's basically 4.5.
I think if you ask the average player, I think they'll say like it makes a huge difference that you have to balance 3 races over 4 races. And I think they would point to the data point of generally Starcraft 1 and Starcraft 2 have been more balanced than Warcraft 3 historically. However, how I like to see it is Warcraft 3 was kind of played during an era where continuous balance patches were not commonplace in the gaming like community.
It was released
Whereas
in a
StarCraft
time where we get our patches from CDs.
exactly, and then you have like a series of patches that come out in the first 1 or 2 years of the game's lifespan, but then no more like there were no patches for like 10 years, right? No
Yeah.
balance patches for like 10 years essentially. Whereas StarCraft 2 was developed in an era where you expected continuous balance patches. So I agree that Warcraft 3 overall is less balanced than StarCraft 2 historically, but I actually think the main factor here is um, the culture surrounding the game itself and the cadence of balance patches. Um, the cadence of balance patches that have um, affected those two games respectively. Even in the modern era, we see StarCraft 2 has gotten like more patches than Warcraft 3 within a given time span, and therefore you have more time to like you have more iteration time available. You are able to make changes, look at how the changes have affected the game, and then make more and more changes. And I think if Warcraft 3, a game with 4 factions or 4 races, were able to receive the same treatment, I think could achieve a similar level of balance to StarCraft 2.
Yeah, I think so too. I think we are at a pretty balanced state, especially compared to what some people glorify, like patch 1.24 10 years ago. It's a very different world, but I mean, it's from a company standpoint, it's also very understandable because Warcraft 3 has basically no revenue coming in except from the price of the game itself. There's no skins. There's no add-ons whatsoever. There's no co-op. So it's understandable that we don't get the same treatment as StarCraft did.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing that we learned one thing that's kind of interesting about StarCraft is like I think the idea of free to play overall in the gaming community, or not free to play, but like microtransactions, is kind of demonized in the general gaming sphere. But when it comes to StarCraft 2 players, they actually welcome it because they have seen the transition between when StarCraft 2 was a box product to when it was a free to play product. The player base increased dramatically. So we got more players playing the game, the community seemed more lively. And not only that, I think the StarCraft 2 community more understands the business aspect of things. And they understand that when a developer is incentivized to invest in the community, the game becomes better for everyone because the developer is able to put resources into balancing the game, or into adding more skins to the game, into adding more features into the game. So yeah, I just think that's super interesting that like the StarCraft 2 community has a completely different perception of free to play and monetization relative to the rest of the gaming ecosystem.
Yeah, I think it's pretty similar to what happened to the Chinese Warcraft community when NetEase came in and made the game free to play and monetized the custom games or user generated content, etc. It was a pretty similar experience. Maybe RTS gamers are just smarter than the rest.
Yeah, you can come to that conclusion, and I will neither agree nor disagree with you.
Okay. So let's a little role play here. You're on the Warcraft 3 balance team or development team. You have no idea how long there's going to be support. So this patch might be the last we ever get. How brave are you going to be with the changes you want to implement?
I think it would depend on my actual confidence. Like, I think even when I was on the StarCraft 2 team or Warcraft 3 team, um, in my head, I had a number of like, hey, what is the percentage chance that this is going to be the last patch, right? And based on that percentage number in my head, I would hedge my changes around whether around the more dramatic, like reworking entire skills, for example, or leaning towards more just small number changes. So, for example, if I thought, hey, maybe there is like a 90% chance this would be the last patch, I would do basically no reworks, and I would just focus on, hey, making the game in a quote unquote more balanced state for the pro community. And then from if I were like maybe this is 10% the last patch, but 10% chance this is the last patch, then I would be willing to go more extreme, even though there is the 10% possibility that this might be the last patch. And you can honestly, you can never know with 100% certainty that this is not going to be the last patch. And that's just the reality of like how things work within a company or any company.
So basically what you're saying is I'm ignoring the last part. The tank rework is a good sign for the longevity of Warcraft 3, quote Monk 2022. Because that's a pretty brave change, right?
Yeah, I could see that. Yeah. That would be what I would you can't quote me necessarily on that, but I would maybe agree with you on that analysis.
All right. So you gave me the topic of long-term versus short-term balancing. And I added, feel free to add some points here, because what do you mean by short-term balancing, long-term balancing? Is that the last question already, or is there a difference?
Yeah, it's basically the last question of like looking forward, like there's maybe there's like 10 spells or abilities in the game that are underused. Like, how do we make sure that the players feel like they have more choices, and that adds to the funness, and that adds to like player agency, and it expands how like just overall higher quality the game is. But no one is complaining about those. Like, no one is complaining that Life Drain is like not ever picked, for example, right? In terms of like the pro players. So do we focus on, hey, these are the small changes that would immediately affect game balance, or do we look more long term in terms of like how do we want the game to play out, and how do we make sure that all possible spells are viable and all the number of choices players have at any given time is maximized?
Yeah, that might lead us to an interesting topic. When I analyze Remo's feedback, it sometimes felt like he wants to make all heroes playable as a first hero. That they should all be playable as a first hero to more or less degree. So now you're kind of creating your own game. Would you think that this is an approach you should go towards? Should every hero be playable as first? Should some heroes be or have a role as a second or third hero? What's your philosophy on that?
I think if I were to make a game from scratch, if I were to remake Warcraft from scratch, I think the approach that I would go with is it'd be cool that every hero would be viable as a first hero, but it's not necessarily my guiding light. However, it would be a guiding light for me to say that there's there's not like a hero that you have to pick as your first hero for any given faction. So I think right now, Undead is actually doing a little better than it has historically, in that you can sometimes go Lich or Crypt Lord, or if you're brave, you can even go Dreadlord first. At times, I think Orc has the Blade Master or Farseer right now, even though we're probably seeing more Farseer. Um, and I think Night Elf has a host of options, but I think Human is probably the one that struggles with this the most at this time, which has not always been the truth, not always been true historically. We've seen we've seen Mountain King, Pally be both viable options in the past, and we've seen even who's Michael's brother again? No, Michael, right?
Yeah.
No, Lucifer's brother's Michael. Michael used to go
Thunder.
like Blood Mage first.
Yeah,
Thunder, yeah. Thunder went Blood Mage first, and that was pretty cool. But right now, I'd say like Human is probably the faction that like maybe could use more options. However, yeah, like again, like I wouldn't say like we necessarily need every hero to be viable as a first choice hero. And I think like it's actually cool that some heroes are more like second or third picks, because it gives them more personality and it allows you to design them in a way to differentiate them as much as possible. I think one of the lessons that I learned in game design is that you don't want everyone to like necessarily like every hero. You want some players to love heroes and some players to hate that hero, and you want to make them as different as possible so that like player A loves playing with the Mountain King first, right? But player B doesn't. But compared to like if that same player liked to play with all the heroes equally, I think the player that loves Mountain King first would have more fun in the game overall. And I think you can see that with the legendary player AKM, for instance.
He's probably listening, I guess. But this is also something that you can see in other genres like Diablo, right? Like I would always play a Sorc or I don't know, a Demon Hunter in D3. I would never play a Barb. It's just the way I'm made or the way I play games. So I think that's a pretty good approach that works throughout genres.
Yeah, a lot of lessons from like like I think game design in some ways is universal, in that like lessons you learn from one genre apply to other genres as well. And there's like a lot of lessons that you can take from other genres um, that like game mechanics and other genres that can help you with the RTS genre. So if I were to talk about like Stormgate for 1 second, like one lesson that we learned from MOBAs is the idea of respawnable creeps or respawnable jungle, for instance. Because you often do have that problem in Warcraft 3, especially on Echo Isles, where you creep the entire map and like, okay, what now?
Yep.
Right.
Yep. Shop control.
So, but shop control, exactly. And then, but if you have these map objectives that respawn and are continuous over the course of the game, you eliminate that problem from happening. And I think a lot of people get nervous when you start talking about mixing MOBAs and RTSs because of the high prominence of hero units in MOBAs relative to RTSs. But you can look at other factors of MOBAs and learn lessons from those as well. And I think oftentimes like we are learning the wrong lessons from other genres.
All right. So in a MOBA, of course, you have a role as a player, whether it's support or carry or whatever. Units have roles as well, right? So if you look at the balance, or since you're creating a new game now, how do you create a role for a unit, or are they predefined roles for a faction that these units have to fulfill then?
So I think there's different philosophies of RTS game design, and I think specifically for Blizzard RTSs, it is very role based in that, and I would say even more so for Warcraft 3 than Starcraft 2. But basically, you kind of think like of like a cool idea, and then you need to figure out a role for it in some way because you don't want multiple units to necessarily fulfill the exact same role.
Yeah.
And I think generally Warcraft 3 does a good job of this, with the possible exception of like Human has a lot of anti-air units that kind of do very similar things. I think the best example is both the Flying Machine and the Dragonhawk Rider are like obviously both specifically anti-air units, and they kind of counter slightly do different things, but in practice, they counter very similar things at the same time.
As well as the gyro flag cannon plus barrage, it's also
yeah
AoE anti-air, basically. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, and then you have the rifles, and like the barrage is like the barrage and the flat cannon gyros are like specifically countering like similar things, mass air, and like yeah, it's quite odd. It's quite odd, I would say.
All right. So basically, a unit should always have a role in the game.
Yeah. So a unit should always have a role, and one change we made in StarCraft is we had this unit called the Cyclone, which had a very ambiguous role. So it had the role of it was kind of like an all-around ground attacker, and then it got an upgrade to hit air units, but not hit air units very well. It just tickled the air units in a way. And in that way, the unit had a very ill-defined role. So we kind of we were thinking, we should rework this unit so that it's more clear what this unit does. And when you have a unit that has a more defined role, it's easier to communicate towards new players. Hey, your opponent is doing X, so you need to build this unit in order to beat X. And it's also more intuitive for the um, the opposite player to say, hey, you're building this unit Y, and therefore I need to build unit Z in order to beat unit Y. Because you have this cyclone unit that is kind of good against ground and kind of good against air. You both have you have player paralysis on both sides of like when do I build this and how do I beat this? Because it's good against everything in general.
All right. So speaking of counters, I want to know, like, are you a fan of hard counters that require a tech switch from a player, or should there always be more like soft counters where the unit can work to a degree, but it's really hard? Like, what's your philosophy on this?
I think so I think when people often talk about hard counters and soft counters, I think they paint it overall too black and white. And I think the idea of soft counters and hard counters is more of a spectrum, right? And I think it is really cool that, for example, as a StarCraft 1 example, you are sometimes able to beat siege tanks with vultures if you have good micro. And technically, you could say the siege tank is maybe a pretty hard counter to the vulture, but in niche scenarios, if with a higher degree of player skill, if players are able to exercise that skill, they can beat the siege tanks with vultures. However, I think one thing that one thing that like Warcraft 3 does well is that there is not necessarily any one end game army that beats everything. So in Starcraft 2, you can actually make like a Protoss or Terran or Zerg. They can make this super army with 200 supply that beats everything on the opponent side. And you can make for example, a Carrier High Templar or Tempest army, and you have no real incentive to deviate from that composition. Whereas I think one thing that Warcraft does, because I actually believe Warcraft is a more hard counter game, is that you never have like an ultimate army. If your opponent is building too many chimeras, because the chimera is very one-dimensional, you are able to build an anti-air unit and you will beat mass chimeras. If your opponent is making mass Tauren, for example, that is a rather
stupid
it has
idea.
Clear strengths and it has clear strengths and weaknesses though. So you're able to build like chimeras in order to beat it. So I actually think it is actually very useful for a game to be more hard countery, like I would characterize Warcraft 3 to be.
For the people in the chat, yeah, we know that Fiends, Destroyers, Statues, and Banshees exist. We're going to just skip on it. We all know it. We all know it. So,
well, I would even say, like, in that perspective, that is only true for 1v1, right? Because like in a free for all or like a big team game, I know if you use Fiends in free for all as well, or in team games as well, but like the ultimate army of the undead doesn't necessarily involve Crypt Fiends in the extreme late game, for example.
Interesting point. Do you care about team games at all when touching balance?
I think it really depends on the game you're designing for. So in Starcraft 2, I would say we cared about it maybe like 0.1%. Like if we ever made a change that like completely like broke the game, then we that broke the game for 2v2 or team games, then maybe we would care, but it was a very small consideration because of how esports focused and how 1v1 focused Starcraft 2 was.
So
but
now
in Warcraft 3, I believe
we got 4 and 4. That's really popular.
Yeah, 4 is really popular. But even historically, before 4v4 was popular, I remember about like 15 years ago, there was a balance change made specifically for 2v2, which was Wolves gave more experience because the combination of Farseer and Keeper was too oppressive in 2v2 Warcraft 3. And people don't talk about this enough, but I believe that was the reason for, or part of the reason for the Blade Master dominance. Yeah. Because Wolves got weaker and Farseer became less of a choice. 100%. So that was a balance change made specifically in the patch notes. It said we made this change specifically because of dominance in 2v2. That was a change made for 2v2 that directly impacted like the overall like trajectory of Warcraft 3 when it came to 1v1 over the next 10 years.
Rotterdam is still mad about that change from 15 years ago. But yeah.
I actually... Funny story, like back when I was covering StarCraft 2 for Team Liquid, they buffed Farseers when I was still on Team Liquid, and I told Rotterdam in an interview, and he was like, "Oh my God, I would be the best player in the world."
I remember that. It was cute little monk from like, I don't know, 10 years ago ish.
Yeah, that was about 10 years ago.
Yeah. Ah, you can find it on YouTube, I guess. Let's see. Rotterdam Team Liquid should be there. Ah, you guys are smart. You'll find out. All right, so
That was an interview with Bunny as well, if you remember.
yeah, there was a real nice deep dive into Warcraft 3 history. We should do that again for, I don't know, next year is a pretty sweet anniversary. Maybe we get the gang back together. It's going to be 20 years of TFT, if I'm not mistaken. So, should we, in the Warcraft sphere, where 4-on-4 is very popular, but the main viewership is on 1-on-1, should we care about 4-on-4, 2-on-2? Because I haven't heard any balanced feedback from the team game aspect so far on patch 1.35.
I think from the team balance aspect, it's very difficult to get balance information. There's not many, if any, like broadcasted tournaments. We don't even know like what the pro meta is, like the quote unquote pro meta is really like. So I think how I would approach it is like if you make a change that completely breaks team games, then like maybe we don't consider it. But the focus probably should be on 1v1, not just because it's like the most viewed, but because there is like data and there is some level of pro player feedback. That being said, I believe there is actually a change in the PTR that actually addresses team games, which is the Bat Rider change. I think Bat Riders, like with very rare exception, are not really used in 1v1, but they are very powerful in team games. And specifically very annoying in team games.
Yes.
And the Bat Rider change that was made in that patch, I believe, does actually try to address 4v4 specifically.
Okay, that's pretty cool that they pay attention to that as well. There's another aspect about balancing that we didn't talk about yet, but that the community has been doing for a bit, and that is balancing through maps. So if Blizzard disappears, do you think we could take faith in our own hands, and how much can we accomplish by just changing maps without touching the actual unit and hero balance?
I think that really depends from game to game. Starcraft 1 Brood War has a history of changing the balance through maps. So in Starcraft 1, the community was used to the idea that Blizzard would never touch the game in terms of balance. So they actually rotated maps on a seasonal basis. So every time you had a GSL or an OSL or a GSL or an MSL, you would rotate the maps. And they actually rotated the balance in order to, they rotated the maps to ensure balance. So for example, there was one season where Flash, a Terran player, was so dominant and Flash won like 3 or 4 seasons in a row that they tried to like specifically curate new maps that would be anti-Terran. And I think Flash still got like second place in that season. I would say like, yes, this is I think it's possible in Warcraft 3 to change the balance through maps. Because balance, like maps do affect balance in Warcraft 3 by quite a bit. But I think based on the current community and like what players are used to these days, I think it would be rather difficult to implement because players are not used to playing on and practicing new maps on a seasonal basis. And the infrastructure to get these maps into the game is not really there. Back in the OSL and MSL days, the tournament organizers would pay map makers who are very knowledgeable about game balance to create maps that are specifically good or bad against in certain matchups and against certain races. However, we don't really have that infrastructure right now in the Warcraft 3 community.
I kind of concur, because the map making community is pretty connected with War 3 Champions. War 3 Champions does a map pool update every 3.5 months, if I'm not mistaken. And we could implement it to the tournament map pool whenever we want.
Yeah. You could do that. But again, the Warcraft 3 community is used to playing Turtle Rock and Echo Isle and Twisted Meadows for 20 years. So I think you would have to get players like used to the idea of the maps constantly change. But I think it is possible. And if anyone can do it, you can, Neo.
Yeah, I mean, we did have some success recently. There's quite a few new maps in the pool that's also getting playtime, like Springtime, Shallow Grave, Tide Hunters especially. That's all non-Blizzard maps. And also, what was really cool recently is changing the old maps and modernize them, like a Twisted, like the Cursed Echo Isles that has an update now. So that could maybe... It's like the best of both worlds. We cater towards the conservative Warcraft community that loves to play on their old maps while updating them to the way the game is played right now, and maybe tweak balance a little bit as well.
Yeah, and the other thing is like, how centralizing can you, like, is there a central body, like an authority figure to like dictate the map pool, right? So for example, you have like back to Warcraft Cups. You also have W3 Champions, but you also have all these like Chinese tournaments. Can you get everyone to agree on a certain set of maps for players to practice on? And that's a rhetorical question.
Okay. So the answer is yes. It always takes a little bit until the Chinese scene catches on, but we're talking with the Korean tournament organizers quite a bit and discuss maps. So I think if maps are good, they get playtime. And they get playtime everywhere. Because there is no netties anymore, as you know, that's gone. And the Battle.net ladder is irrelevant. There's, I guess, ESL Meisterschaft, but we can influence that as well to a degree. So yeah, we can influence everyone.
So what you're announcing here today is that the next season of all Warcraft 3 tournaments will be played on six Terranistan clones.
Yes, of course. We're bringing Nullwood back as well. It's gonna be great. Or maybe one-on-one on Friends. We'll see about that.
I don't know if you want to have like 6-hour games or 6-hour and 24-hour tournament broadcast days.
I mean, do you know how much time that is in Twitch ads?
Always thinking about the Twitch ads, especially in December.
I disabled it for this talk. So, is there anything else you want to talk about balance-wise before we go into maybe patch 1.35 and your opinion on it?
Well, I know one of your popular ideas, Neo, is a community council.
Yes.
In order to dictate balance.
Yes.
Do you want to introduce that topic?
Well, it does work for Starcraft 2, as far as I know. I don't know how public that is, but from what I know, and you just said it as well, like Blizzard is in talk with the pro players. I would love that. I would love to get a fellowship of the balance and discuss things and then present a paper from that council to Blizzard on what we think the issues are and how to fix it. And I think we do have the people in the community that are knowledgeable about the game, that are not biased or not too biased, and that are reasonable to work with. And with decent leadership and some moderation, I think that could work really, really well.
So I think there's two ideas here. Number one is what you just said, the idea of gathering a community council in order to gather feedback and send it to Blizzard. And I think that's actually a really great idea. And it eliminates some of the challenges of Blizzard working with the community and the inability for Blizzard to work with the community. And it would still allow higher quality feedback to go to Blizzard. So if someone in the community, such as yourself, Neo, thinks that you can organize something like that, I think it would be very beneficial for the community overall. I think the other idea you had was kind of building a community council that would fork balance. So we would have like a community made patch for Warcraft 3.
Yes.
Do you want to talk about that a bit first?
Well, that was a couple of months ago. Especially in late spring, I think, May, I guess, where I thought that we would never see a balance patch from Blizzard again. Of course, it would be better if the balance is coming from Blizzard, because then the community is not up in arms and it's not cannibalizing each other over some balance changes. But I think if the day comes, and the day will come eventually, that there's not going to be any Blizzard patches anymore, but we do see issues with the balance, then I think we can do it ourselves as the community, not with radical changes like the mechanical critter can all of a sudden explode. That's maybe a bit too drastic, but smaller changes, because we could tweak small numbers easily, unlike Blizzard, I guess. We could change the Headhunter balance by 1 in the span of a day. Like, it doesn't take much. So small, easy changes should be fine. Of course, that would create problems with people playing on War3 Champions and people playing on Battle.net, playing on a different balance. But I think, should we really worry about that? Are the people playing on Battle.net really our problem? I don't think so. So, in my opinion, if changes are not too drastic, we can definitely do that and should do that as a community once we don't get support from Blizzard anymore.
Yeah. My worry about that is primarily that once you do that, you kind of fork the player base, and there are going to be a subset of people who are getting to Warcraft 3 and playing on Battle.net, and a subset of people who are playing on Warcraft 3 Champions. And just anecdotally, more recently, because there's a Battle.net ladder, I've been playing a lot of 2v2s on Battle.net, but I also sometimes play 2v2s on War3 Champions. So if that were to happen, I would essentially be playing on 2 different sets of balance, right? It would be kind of discombobulating to go back and forth between the 2. And then another issue is, and I'm sure one that you're familiar with, is like, what is the council that would actually decide on the changes? And I have a worry about this because I think the Starcraft 2 community is in a better position to do this because of the years of experience that they have talking with Blizzard designers and experiencing a regular cadence of balance patches. Whereas, like, I think overall as a community, the Warcraft 3 community has less game design experience overall.
Oh, 100%. So we need you on the council. Oh, that laugh is a clear no. No, of course you have bigger fish to fry, but I would put my trust into a handful of people that I will of course not announce, because the day might come and they need to be in the shadows for sure. They need to be anonymous. But I think in April we have shown that we can discuss balance. When I raised the question, like, what would you change about balance? We had a lot of good papers, and we had a lot of good and healthy discussion, which is now leading to patch 1.35, because I'm pretty sure 90% of the changes are coming from the discussion we had in April, and those will turn out to be good changes, with some new spice added, like the tank, of course, like the crow form, etc. But as I said, very, very conservative. Like, if you know the balance on Battle.net and War3 Champions, and you see that, for example, Headhunters or Entangle is less of a problem on War3 Champions and the game is more fair, you would play on War3 Champions. So it could even be an incentive for more players to play on the better balance on the community server. But it's tough.
I have nothing to add to that.
That is a super tough task, and Blizzard, I would love to not do that job as well. So just continue with the balance, I guess. Yeah, it would be really rough. But we built our own server system. We can do our own balance. I'm pretty sure there's nothing we can't do in this community, except maybe raise a lot of prize money. That is something apparently we can't do.
Gotta get working on those pitch decks, Neo.
Yeah, there is work. Yep, there is work to do. So, want to talk patch 1.35, or is there anything else you want to talk about?
No, let's talk about it.
Let's talk about it. came as a big surprise. We discussed the changes. I think everybody should be aware of what the changes are. If not, they are compiled on Reddit in a very beautiful way where you helped me with that compilation by prioritizing stuff. So Blizzard, please take notes from the Reddit balance change thread as well on how to publicize your changes. So first of all, the general direction. Thumbs up, thumbs in the middle, thumbs down. What's your opinion?
Yeah, I generally really like the general direction. I think both like the things that they are generally touching are in the right direction. And not only that, but there's some like spicy creative changes, which gives me personally a lot of excitement. And as a player, it makes me think, oh, like I want to try this out and I want to experiment with this game. And it gives me as a player more incentive to get back into the game as someone who might have churned.
So when you look at these changes overall, do you see a general philosophy behind these changes or general reasoning behind these changes?
I think the general philosophy, it's hard to say, but I would say the general philosophy is like take a look at the community complaints and buff or nerf the things that are complained about, and then in addition to that, add some cool things to underused stuff. So it's kind of two philosophies, which is totally okay. We did a lot of end of year patches on the Starcraft2 team that had these like two mixed philosophies. But at the same time, I think as a designer, you have to like temper like how far can we really go if this is the last patch. This is a topic we've talked about.
Yeah.
And with the things that are like with the number tweaks, you have to figure out what are the right numbers to tweak. So one thing I did really want to talk about is like I want to use the example of headhunters, right? And I think the change to headhunters is the cost change. And this will like kind of reiterate a lot of topics that we talked about, like, but what is the actual problem with headhunters? So you can ask a pro player and they can say at the very general level, orc is overpowered, right? And the next level they can say is like when you dig into more specifics, they can say the headhunter is overpowered, right? But then you can ask what is overpowered with the headhunter, and you could say, oh, you can mask them too easily. Maybe that's the problem. But the thing that I've heard the most is the reinforcement time of the headhunters is too low. So you can build up the first 6 headhunters too easily, and that dominates the headhunters. That dominates the early game so much. So if that specifically is the problem, then I would maybe look into increasing the build time of the headhunters because that would compound. If you just increase it by 2 seconds, the first 600, the sixth headhunter would take 12 more seconds to reinforce, and that's a huge difference within the context of Warcraft 3. You can also, if that is the actual problem, maybe you can look at it as maybe it's not the headhunters that are overpowered, but maybe it's the ability for the Farseer to continuously summon wolves that is overpowered. So maybe there's a solution where you actually don't touch the headhunters at all, if that is the only problem. But then you can look at it and say, there are perhaps other problems with headhunters. There's another problem with headhunters. And another problem I would say with headhunters right now is that I personally think they're too easy to use than they are to defend. I think you see like anywhere between like the wide range of like the 1300 level to the 2000 level. I think the execution required to defend against headhunters is much higher than the execution it needs to use headhunters. So then you have to make the judgment call of like how much do we care about that segment of players versus the top segment of players. And if that is the case, like how can we adjust this, right? So if that is the problem, then maybe we look at a cost change or we maybe look at a stats change. But I think like where I wanted to get with this is like first you have to identify the exact problems that you're trying to address in very specific terms, and then design a change that can address that problem. Whereas I think maybe currently the current change, which is like reducing the wood cost of or increasing the wood cost of the headhunters, or originally the change was like increasing the cost of the headhunters. I think that change is specifically addressing or generally addressing headhunters are too strong rather than a specific problem with headhunters. Whereas the current wood change, I think, is addressing more of like the ability to get other tech and tech quickly when you are going a headhunter route, which I'm not sure is like the right direction to go with the game because Orc is already so lumber starved.
Yeah, when you worry about the easiness of headhunters, you could also raise the question: is it because of the headhunters, or is it because the Farseer is creating so much space with the wolves, so the headhunters are in a safe space at the second row or even the third row behind the Farseer? So just this one thing, headhunters are too strong, is raising a million questions already, with 1,000,000 times 5 ways to tackle it. Like, balance seems to be a nightmare to solve. Like,
it's
yeah, go ahead.
it's very difficult, but I think it's actually like it's kind of like solving a mystery, right? Um, it's like you're like digging down, like you're like interviewing pro players. Hey, like where were you at the scene of the crime, and like what did
Exactly.
you see? And you're trying to build all the pieces together, and using all these pieces, you're trying to like solve a puzzle. And I find that like very fun myself, and that's partly why like I do the job that I do, and I love this job.
It's like a game of Clue with a little bit of trial and error,
Mhm.
I guess.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
yeah.
I love how there's like a creative aspect to it as well. Like there is not necessarily one right answer.
Did you hear that? People of the internet, Twitch chat. There's not the one right answer. Your answer is not the only right one. So open your mind to other ideas, I guess. So, there's a couple of things that stand out, and I think something that hasn't been touched in a long time is revive costs and how an altar works and how a tavern works. And this is the one thing that goes for the entire game and all 4 races, of course, that altar hero cost was reduced and the tavern revive cost was increased. So is that something you agree with? Is that the right thing? Is that maybe something they do because they realize a problem, but they can't fix the problem otherwise?
Again, I don't want to like put like words into other like the Blizzard's mouth or
Of
anything,
course.
but with the revive or the alter revive cost, my thought about this problem, quote unquote problem, is um so with the change specifically, it's increasing it by 5%. And I feel like it's not a meaningful amount, and it makes the numbers a little wonky.
Yes.
Um, so those are like the kind of like we want to make the smallest changes that have the greatest impact. And even though I believe this is a small change, and like it's a small change, but it doesn't really make the impact. I think the root problem that that change is trying to solve is that um, there's not a lot of tension behind the choices that you're making when you're reviving a hero, and that you almost always want to revive from the tavern rather than the altar itself.
Mhm.
And I know, Neo, we've talked about this, but um, like the curve that the game uses to determine how long it takes to revive a hero from an altar spikes up. So for a level 1 hero, it's reasonable, but for level 2, level 3, level 4, it becomes insane.
Yeah.
I've looked into the how you would change that, but this is an example of something that is kind of hard coded into the game, and you would need to adjust the C++ in order to actually suggest. So I think this is this my my thought is like maybe this is trying to address in an issue the same issue in a way that doesn't necessarily require you to delve into the code.
Yeah, that might be a little too expensive for our old game. Yeah, so hopefully this leads to somewhere, or maybe they scratch it. We'll see about that. The human changes. Do you agree that what is changed on the PTR will tackle the problems that human have? What are the problems that human has? What's your opinion on this?
So before I give specific like balance thoughts, like I want to like I want to like stipulate that like I'm not necessarily like a balance designer for Warcraft 3,
Yes.
and I'm coming at things more from a design perspective rather than necessarily like um someone who is like extremely knowledgeable about like pro levels of play. Um, so one of the things I'm thinking, so the first thing is the peasant HP change, which is like an overall buff to peasant HP.
Mm-hmm.
So overall, I think that's another example of a change that it doesn't hit any breakpoints. or it kind of does hit breakpoints if you account for like glitch changes later down in the patch notes, but overall it doesn't hit like important break. There's also a warden change that like how it interacts with warden, which I don't think was intended. But
Maybe you can
I think
explain a
overall,
breakpoint real quick before diving.
yeah, yeah. So basically, breakpoints are when I use a spell and it kills peasants in one shot versus two shots. That is, if I buff a peasant by 10 HP and it changes the number of hits it takes for, let's say, Frost Nova to kill a peasant, it is essentially a like a 100% buff rather than like a 5% buff than it actually is. This is something that mattered a lot for StarCraft, more so than Warcraft, because in StarCraft the number of shots to kill a unit was often very low. So you often had change if you increased a unit by 5 HP, you'd often change the number of hits to kill a unit from 4 to 5, for instance, which was a 20% increase. So whenever we made changes to damage and HP and armor or anything in StarCraft, we actually had a spreadsheet where we would look at where we change a unit and then we look at its resulting interactions against every other unit in the game against on every possible upgrade level. So for example, +3 attack versus +2 armor from the defender. How would that change the number of shots to kill? So we would always, whenever we would make any change to like the damage or HP of a unit, we would take a look at those metrics rather than like this, we changed the HP by 5%. We actually don't care about that number. Rather, we care about how many more shots does it take to kill for all the other units in the game. And from the Warcraft 3 perspective, that matters a lot less from the attacking perspective because units take it goes from like 20 shots to kill to 21, and that's not as big of a difference.
Yeah.
And you can use the percentage change of the HP as a proxy. However, Warcraft 3 is very focused around spells. So when it comes to spells, the number of shots it takes to kill a unit from like a fan of knives or from like one fan of knives to two fan of knives versus like to three fan of knives is very significant. So one of the things that the community has pointed out is actually that the number of with the peasant HP changes, the number you need to like hit peasants one more time with a warden in order to kill them with two fan of knives, for instance, and that is very significant. And the reason that I bring that up is that it has the peasant change, I believe, is specifically intended to address like human versus undead, but I think it has a lot of repercussions in other matchups that are unintended. So with this general HP peasant HP change, I think it affects too many matchups, and the reasoning behind it, I imagine, is like to make peasants more durable. But I think if the problem, and I would speculate that the problem that Blizzard sees as human versus undead, I would try to target these changes towards more of a human undead matchup. So, for example, later on we see changes with like staves and orbs. Those are examples of changes that would more directly affect the human versus undead matchup without necessarily affecting many of the others.
Okay. I think that the peasant harass is also a little bit of a problem versus Night Elf, and like also versus Orc. Like they are getting harassed everywhere all the time in the early game, especially. So I personally like that. It might be that they survive 2 entangles now, if I'm not mistaken. So I see this on Tidehunters all the time, for example. A keeper creeps level 2 and boom, there's entangle, there's treants, there's a lot of harass, and then the expo is so delayed that they got run over. Farseer headhunters do the same in that matchup. I don't know. A little bit of help, even if there's no breakpoint, this might just also be a little psychological help, because humans they're suffering for a long time, let's be honest, and most of it is due to the weak economy, or that their peasants, that their workers are getting killed all the time. So a little bit of help might just be also psychological reason. Is that a thing in balancing?
Yeah, totally. And we'll get to this a bit later, but whenever we made these like huge balance changes in StarCraft 2, we always tried to buff every race in some way. To give them something to try for the psychological reason. And we'll later see that there are no buffs to undead, for instance. Well, besides like animate dead, there are no buffs to undead.
Yeah.
So the psychological change does matter. However, I would still say like like you talked about like shots to kill from Entangle, how it affects that matchup. I would like to see like more evidence from and more research from players, like how does this specifically affect interactions. Again, we're like talking about specificity rather than generally peasants are durable. How does in practice, how does this change each matchup? And in the same vein, like I think what you talked about, like we want Blizzard's rationale for why they're doing things, right?
Yeah.
If their rationale is we want to increase peasant like, durability overall because they're too weak overall, okay, that makes sense. But if their rationale is like we want to specifically help one single matchup, then it maybe does not make sense as much.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. So, any other comment? I guess we have to talk about tanks when we talk about human changes, because this is something that I think no Warcraft player, fan, observer understands and also didn't expect. Like, this is one of the biggest reworks that a unit has gotten for as long as I can remember.
Yeah, I think maybe the last one was like yeah, I can't think of a bigger rework, I would say,
Yeah, me neither.
in like the last few years. Maybe the mirror image thing is kind of like a big change.
Yeah,
Um, let's see, mountain giants were changed quite a bit. The knight was given like a little more like a cool new ability.
yeah. Back in the day,
Um,
walkers became magic immune. So they couldn't be Cyclone, that was big, but also just in probably War Metro. This is the
yeah,
biggest rework in ever.
yeah. How I would say this change is like players. I think players do not have fun playing against this strategy.
Yeah.
Um, so it's like in a lot of like multiplayer game design, it's not only like how much fun is the player having, but how much fun is it to play against, or how frustrating it is to play against. And you often what you can do is like you can compare like how much fun like the player using it is having versus how frustrating it is to play against. And I would say with tanks overall, it leans towards more frustrating for the defender than it is fun for the attacker. So I think that is where this change is coming from. And what this change is trying to do is it's trying to distribute its power so that it's less pointed and it becomes more of a generalist overall. The funny thing about this change is like I think the original designers of the Frozen Throne actually saw this as a problem as well. Because what they did was they added the barrage upgrade to siege engines, which allowed them to give them an additional role of attacking air. So the original designers were like, okay, this unit is too frustrating to play against. Is there any way we could like make it a more of an all-around unit so that we could take away some of its power from its anti-building aspect and give its power somewhere else? So it got an anti-air attack. And what this current PTR change is trying to do is trying to give it a third role in that it attacks ground units as well. Um, and my thoughts on this are it's similar to the Cyclone in StarCraft 2 that I talked about earlier, where the Cyclone did a lot of things and it did them all like somewhat well. But again, as a player, I do not really completely understand when I want to make this. And I think for siege tanks, for siege engines in Warcraft 3, you kind of do understand the counters a little more. But overall, it's like it becomes a very confusing, unpointed unit. And how I would go about making a change to the siege engine is it already has two roles, and it is currently not used for the anti-air role in 1v1 games. So I would try to rework the tank so that you take away some of its power from the anti-building role and move it more towards the anti-air role. But then you have the consideration of like human already has so many anti-air units. Like, how do you make sure that it has its unique anti-air role, which human is already struggling with? So there's a lot of considerations there.
So, if you could decide, would you give the change a thumbs down and scratch it, or continue to tinker with it, or keep it the way it is now on the
I
PTR?
would say on the PT, I would say like I think you can go in one of two directions. If you want to be more conservative, I would just revert it.
Mhm.
And the direction that I would go with this unit, if like I really wanted to, um, if I really wanted to like make a change to this unit, is I would move its, like I talked about before, move
Yeah.
its anti-building role into an anti-air role. So right now it's actually very good at like free for all team games, but the reason it's good is because it hits like it hits 11 units. And when are you ever going to see 11 air units in a 1v1 game, right? So I would try to like make the anti-air a little more powerful, but make it hit less units overall. So, but then like I think, and I think you would have to do this with the intention of like this is not the last patch, and you make
Yes.
the change and you see would people build this unit versus like people build this unit when they could be building flying machines, right? Because they fulfill very similar roles. So another idea I had was like maybe you change the damage type from piercing to siege.
Mhm.
So you make it do a similar amount of damage to unarmored units like gargoyles, for instance, but you make it really bad against destroyers and make it really bad against like frost worms and chimera, for example. So because of changing the damage type, you are able to differentiate it from the flying machine, which does piercing. You're able to differentiate it from the Dragonhawk, which is more against single target biological units. Um, and you're able to differentiate it from the rifleman, which also does piercing damage.
All right. So if you have a big change like this, we can move away from the siege engine, but it's a pretty good example. You basically change the core of the unit. Should this mean that you also tackle the cost, the supply, the XP? Because it's basically a different unit now. It's easier to kill. Should it give less XP when it's easier to kill? It's not that great against. Oh, it is great against. No, it's not that great against buildings anymore because it's easier to kill. Should it still be for supply? Like, doesn't this raise a lot of additional questions?
Yeah, it totally does. And I guess how like this would be a huge rework, but like depending on its armor type, how hard it is to kill, I think you probably do want to rebalance it with the idea that it is easier to kill. So
Yeah.
I think what a lot of people don't know is that the siege engine. What level is it right now? Is it level 4 or level 6 or level 5 or?
It's level 4.
It's level 4. Okay. So it used to be like a 3 supply unit and
Yes.
it was level 3, but now it's a 4 supply unit. It's level 4. And then I think you would have to like look at the stats and see like how much is this unit actually worth? Because right now it is like statted in a way that like it probably gives more experience than its actual like cost value. Generally, I think units like um if they cost like 100 gold, for instance, they're a level 1 unit and they give a level 1 unit of supply, for instance. And if they cost 200 gold, I'm making up numbers here, of course.
Yeah.
If they cost 200 gold, they give like a level 2 worth of supply. But the siege engine is probably lean towards giving more experience just because of how frustrating it is to play against and how relatively it used to be in terms of it used to be unpunishing to lose that unit.
Yeah, I think so too. We've had drastic changes to the Crypt Lord, for example, where the summons just got doubled, but there was no additional change to the mana cost at the beginning. There's other examples like the Keeper, etc., where like it was just a lot stronger without additional cost, and I think so too. Should be looked into at least a little bit. Any other comments on?
These kind of changes, I was just gonna say these kind of changes you're not gonna get these huge reworks you're not gonna be able to get right the first time.
Yeah.
It's just not possible. So you would have to like the community would have to be able to live with the fact that hey maybe this unit is going to be a little overpowered for a while, similar to the Crypt Lord or the Keeper.
Yeah.
However, what I will say is it's probably going to be less problematic overall because the Keeper and the Crypt Lord were two heroes that you're pushed to get early on,
Yes.
and it affected a very, very large number of games, whereas reworking a siege tank would maybe, or a siege engine would maybe only affect like 10% of games,
Yeah.
perhaps.
Since it's tier 3, of course, makes a lot of sense. Anything else you want to say about the human changes? I think spellbreakers were a big point of yours.
Yeah, spellbreakers. I don't have too many thoughts on spellbreakers, but the one thing I do have is I do think about is like the orb of fire damage.
Oh,
I
yeah.
think I think like in my perspective, the coolness of like from a game design perspective, the coolness of what an orb should be in its effect rather than its damage output.
Yes.
And I actually really dislike how the orb actually adds 7 damage currently. as opposed to all the other orbs that add 5 damage. I think from a player perspective, you're learning, hey, this orb adds 5 damage, that orb adds 5 damage, the third orb adds 5 damage. And even like the other orbs in the game, like the Orb of Frost, you can get in team games. You can get the Orb of Darkness on like Twisted Meadows. They all add 5 damage, but then you have this one orb that adds 7 damage, and that annoys me a lot.
And there's
so
also,
instead of like adding,
there's no real synergy, right? Like if a human hero would have like a crit ability or something, then it might make a little sense because, you know, you got that crit, you get more damage from the orb, it's kind of fine. But there's no synergy at all. And doesn't Archmage really need more damage, or a Blood Mage or something? Doesn't feel right.
Yeah, so how I would go about that is that I would actually lower the damage of the orb back to 5 and then decrease its cost substantially. And what that would do is it would allow human players to get that orb in the human versus undead matchup much more easily.
Yes.
And you could spend that extra money instead of getting +5 damage on your Archmage, you could get like half of a knight, for instance.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I said this on my feedback, and we saw it yesterday on the Grubby stream. I don't want a human pit lord with 6 orbs again. That was fun for like the 2 weeks we had in patch 1.3 or something, but no, please don't. Yeah. Anything else with the human, or do you want to continue with, I don't know, Night Elf?
Let's talk about Night Elf.
Okay, Keeper. Entangle nerfed, Thorn's Aura buffed, Tranquility nerfed. A lot of Night Elves are crying that Keeper will not be usable anymore.
I think this is one of those changes where I personally shouldn't talk about too much because this is more of a balance related thing than a design related thing. And I don't completely understand the breakpoints of the spell currently.
Yeah.
But a few ideas, and I think the only 2 changes, I think the Night Elf changes are actually pretty solid overall. I would say Immolation probably a little too strong, but again, not from a design perspective. But also, one idea I have, I think the Druid of the Talon change is really cool because it does allow the Talon to have a niche that it didn't have before, and it was an underused ability. It's also something that it essentially adds a new unit to the game in a way, and that's what excites players a lot. One change I would make to the Talons is I would make the transformation cost a little different. Right now, I think it costs 25 mana to change Druid of the Claw from bears to druids and vice versa, but it costs 50 mana for Druids of the Talon.
Yes.
I think even outside of the complete rework to the Stormcrow form, like I think we should encourage players to use the Druid transformation spells because that is the cool part of the unit, and we should allow players to use their coolness.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And here, I would love to know who came up with it, because that's a change I've never read from the community. This must come from somewhere at Blizzard or from someone who influences them. And that's so cool, because I think we talked about Crowform at a BlizzCon, and nobody really had an idea on how to make them usable. So whoever did this, pretty damn great. And this is also my most anticipated change, because that could change Night Elf vs. Undead, the way it's played, the way you fight in the late game, that you might be able to use Cyclone. Like, this could add such a cool dynamic to this matchup. I'm at the moment theoretically in love with it. Let's see how it works in like real situations.
Maybe we get the mass Druid of the Talon meta yet again, but in the undead matchup.
Well, I don't think it will replace fairies. I don't think you can play them mass. Maybe you can. We'll see about that. The Night Elf players are in general pretty creative, so they will show us the way. So you think the Immolation is in an okay spot? Because a lot of people are worried that this will just dominate.
I mean, I think it's probably a little too strong, but I don't really want to comment on like the
numbers,
the number tweaks. Yeah.
Sorry. But there is a change on Immolation that the tick is every 0.5 second compared to every 1 second, which in my opinion makes the game feel more responsive and more changes like this maybe could update the game in a way. Like, I don't really know why a tick damage of 1 second would be necessary. It feels so slow and sluggish.
Yeah. And I often do like, I think one thing is like the player understands like, hey, I took 10 damage. I'm going to take the next damage in 1 second from now. And I think that could be a reasoning.
Okay.
But Warcraft 3 actually updates at 8 ticks per second. So you could theoretically make it, like the engine updates at 8 ticks per second. So you could theoretically, I think, make it deal damage 8 times every second. So you can cut the damage in eighths even.
Should
and
it do that?
Even go that far.
Should it update the damage every 0.8 second? Why not do this? I mean, yeah, it might be less intuitive, but it's almost real time then.
Yeah, and I think in when we did these kind of abilities in StarCraft, or in StarCraft, both damage over time and heal over time, it was actually over time. So every game tick, it would update with the amount of healing or the damage that you dealt. So for example, priests, they heal like, is it 25 damage every second, and they have to wave their hands and there's a channel animation. The same ability in StarCraft is you draw a beam between the healer and the healee, and it just every game tick it heals X amount of damage. So if you're healing it for 4.7 seconds, if you're healing a unit for 4.7 seconds, you get 4.7 seconds of healing rather than 4 seconds of healing or 5 seconds of healing. And I feel like that makes these units feel more responsive, and it's part of the reason why like dispelling with priests is so frustrating.
It absolutely is.
Warcraft 3.
Yep, dispel. You all know it. So when I look at Night Elf, I see that a lot of units get massed. Like, we have mass hunts, we have mass tier 1 with upgraded archers and hunts, we have mass dryads, we have mass talents. Is that a flaw in the Night Elf design that you can do this? Also mass fairies. Is that a flaw in the Night Elf design, or is it cool to have a race who's able to do this?
I actually think Night Elf has like a okay amount of diversity. One flack I have about like Night Elf units in general, or the design of Night Elf in general, is that you have these 2 upgrade paths. One is like Strength of the Moon, and the other is like, it's basically the male units and the female units in a way.
Yes.
And the fact that like the tier 1 units are the female units, and you have this upgrade path, means it's very difficult to transition from tier 1 units to higher tier units, which is why you have like mass hunt strategies and mass tier 1 strategies, and Night Elf versus Orc, you're incentivized to mass tier 1 the entire game, for instance. And I think it would be cooler like if you design the upgrades in any other way, where like the units kind of mix and match. Like, for example, the humans, they completely mix and match. Like the Griffins have a completely different set of upgrades to siege engines, which have a completely different set of upgrades to like knights, which have a completely different set of upgrades to riflemen. And you can more easily, like if you're going, if you're opening with footmen, for example, and you get the footmen upgrades, you can transition into like Griffins because they share the same upgrades, and that's not super intuitive.
Yeah.
But with Night Elf, you're like, I mass tier 1 or I tech. And I think that if I were to like remake Warcraft 3 from scratch, for instance, I would try to like kind of twist and turn the upgrades into each other.
That would be cool indeed. Moving on to Orc. When I talk to a lot of Orcs, they always come up with, we can't expand. Every other race can tier 1 expand, just as Orcs, we can't. So, should Orcs be able to tier 1 expand? Should it be easier for them to expand? Or should it be the race that just can't do it?
I think that's a philosophical question, but also, I guess in my mind, especially when I was working on the Warcraft 3 team, I always thought the coolness of Warcraft 3 was, and just like RTSs in general, is the idea of territory control, and the idea that you can be on a varied number of bases relative to your opponent. So I like the idea that there is like 1 base versus 1 base play. And I like the idea that there's 1 base versus 2 base play, and I like the idea there's 2 base versus 2 base play, and there's a variety of that. But I felt like in previous Warcraft 3, too much of the gameplay was involving 1 base versus 1 base. So I generally like the idea that different factions can expand all factions have an option to expand. Um, and I also like the idea that some races can expand at different timings better than other races. For example, like human and night elf can expand pretty early, fairly easily, and now undead can expand fairly easily. Um, but I guess what I don't like about orc is like I feel in a lot of matchups you're kind of pigeonholed into expanding it on tier 3. Um, you can expand at tier 2, for instance, in certain matchups, but I don't think it's seen as like super oppressive. But tier 1 it seems to be out of the question. Um, I kind of do like the idea that orcs can expand at tier 1, um, but I'm not sure if like this change is the way to do it. Um, I guess I just don't know how I feel overall about this change. Because at one point, like on one side of the argument, I do like the idea that orcs have this additional option open to them, even though I still believe with these changes, their expansion is going to be weaker than that of all the other 3 races. On the other hand, I do realize that this does influence balance because the regular orc expansion without the tiny great hall is used to expand at tier 2 in a variety of matchups. So I'm pretty conflicted on this change.
All right, yeah, I think this is just something that the meta will show us at any given point. Yeah, a lot of people think that Orc's gonna be OP with mirror image, with the grunt buff, etc. What's your first impression? Do you like the changes?
With the mirror image, I think I honestly don't look at the numbers for mirror image because I
Okay.
believe it will settle at like if this change goes through, I think it will settle at a number that is reasonable, and
Yes.
I think this kind of change is kind of cool.
Yes.
I do think that the mirror images need to give you XP because if they don't, it will be the only like quote unquote summon in the game that can do free damage. And free damage is often is very frustrating to play
Mm-hmm.
against. Like imagine if like you just had a Blade Master go into your base and for example, it just hits up your Moonwell for like 10 damage even. Like if it keeps doing that, even though it doesn't do anything, maybe it's not even good, but the fact that it's able to do that free damage, I think is like from a psychological perspective, very frustrating to play against as a defender. So even if this ability is not imbalanced, I think from a design perspective, um, it's not great. In terms of the grunts overall, I think like this patch currently is pushing players too much towards grunts and away from headhunters. And I think all that needs to be done is one or the other. I don't think you need to pull both levers here, because I think you can get into a situation where like you don't know why the meta is changing. Like you don't know
Yes.
why people are making grunts. Is it because the hunters are worse, or is it because the grunts are better? And I think it's really like from like a growth perspective as a designer, it's really cool that or it's really important to see the effects of your changes and learn from that.
That sounds pretty smart. Indeed. Also, you changed the grunts, the headhunters, and the blade master. So, do you play grunts blade master because of the blade master? Do you play it because of the grunts? That's another riddle you add. So, it's 3 out of 4 factors of the early game of an org that you change at the same time. Pretty good point.
I
Anything?
also want to point out, that like um, both back on the Starcraft and Warcraft teams, we were very careful about changing core units, especially like the tier 1 units, because they have the most dramatic effects on game balance.
Yeah.
So like for example, we put much more restraint when we are changing a Marine rather than changing a battle cruiser. And the similar restraint we should use to like changing the stats of a grunt will affect like 50 times more games than changing the stats of a torrent, for instance.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. Is there anything else that bothers you with Orc? I heard you like stasis traps.
I think like so the problem with the Witch Doctor right now, or a couple of problems. Like the problem with the status trap right now is that it's funny to say this, but it is too good when it goes off. So the spell has to be balanced around the idea that it never goes off. And as a result, it becomes a very binary spell. My idea for how to rework this would be to make it so that it costs less energy and each time it does go off, it's not game ending, but it's easier for it to go off. So for example, like lowering the mana cost, making the AoE a little smaller, um, and making so that like there is counterplay of like you need detection to fight against this. However, each time it goes off, it's not like maybe only a small percentage of your army gets hit, or like you can place it all around the map and you can slow your opponent down. So it's not nearly like an all or nothing spell, because if it's all or nothing, you're like your opponent is like always going to counter it easily, and like a player is never incentivized to build this unit outside of team games. And a perhaps controversial opinion is that I think the biggest buff to healing wards is a buff to stasis ward, because stasis ward is so weak. You have a very long time period where you're just researching both the spells or both the like adept and master training, and after you research adept you get no increase in power essentially, and then you have to upgrade healing wards as well. So the time it takes to pay off to research healing wards to pay off is too high. So if there were some like middle spell that were still useful, I think we could see more play from witch doctors.
That would be pretty cool to see. They're a fun unit, a good support unit. I'd love that. Undead. This is where I have the most problems identifying problems, because everything works so well together. There are synergies everywhere. I think we all agree that it's too strong, but I don't know where to take that strength away.
Yeah, me either. I am not like the most in tune with the meta right now, but like I would look at like why are undead winning right now? And I think one large piece of the puzzle is that undead seems to be balanced around like being a one base race,
Yes.
whereas right now they're consistently able to expand. So maybe their ability to expand should be weakened, as we see with the goldmine change. However, I do want to say that like I don't think necessarily that I don't think like we should eliminate undead expanding altogether. I think, like I said before, I think the ability for undead to expand is very cool, and the ability for every race to have multiple options in terms of the number of bases that they play on is a positive thing. When you add more choices to the game, and you give more agency to the player so that they feel like they can be in control of their own destiny. And not only that, but because undead are able to expand right now, you have a larger diversity of games to watch. So the games are more fun as a viewer perspective, because half the games now the undead expands and half of them play on one base. So you essentially have twice the variety.
Yeah, that's true. It's good. It's pretty similar to Orc, I guess. For a long time, we haven't seen this expansion. Now, Undead was buffed with their expansion the past 2 patches, and Orc is getting that treatment now. Yeah, we'll see about that. But you pointed out something before that also Insub said. There's no cool new stuff. So what can we touch with Undead?
I'm probably not the best person to ask about what cool new stuff to add, but again, on the Starcraft 2 team, whenever we had these like huge patches, we often call them like end of year patches, which is kind of what's happening right now. Every year we would have a big balance patch to shape things up, and we wanted to make sure that every single race, even though like let's say Zerg was getting nerfed overall, we wanted to give them a new cool tool to be inspired by and to experiment with, so that going into the patch, like everyone is feeling at least some amount of fun. Again, like with my philosophy of game balance, like the goal of game balance is not 50-50 win rates necessarily, but it's to maximize the fun of everyone involved. And right now, I think this patch is not doing that for undead players.
Yeah, 100% true. It will take some win percentages away, so it cuts the fun of winning. But I don't know. I don't see any problems with Undead that needs to be tackled, except of them being too good. I don't see any. Maybe the Necro has no play.
Yeah.
That's a problem. There have been some ideas in the past prior to the Reforged launch that were then scratched at the Reforged launch. Yeah. Not sure.
There's a lot of problems with necromancers. I was directly part of the team when we talked about reworking the necromancers. I saw, for example, Seiso had a player called Seiso on the Warcraft 3 forums had some ideas like I think I agree with him in that the biggest problem with necromancers right now, and again, there are many problems with necromancers, but I think the biggest problem is the amount of time and the amount of effort it takes to research everything on the necromancers and
Oh
the
yeah.
cost it takes to research. Effectively, like you need the skeletal mage upgrade, um, and two like necromancer upgrades in order to use them rather effectively. And not only that the research time was buffed, but still like the cost and the research time of the skeletal mage upgrade is still relatively high. And it feels like you're unable to use them that effectively without two bases. Um, in addition, like you kind of really want the exhumed corpses upgrade on the meat wagons as well. So maybe one thing I would do to like throw undead a bone is to like make exhumed corpses there by default. You don't have to research it, um, reducing the cost and mana and like research and time cost of like the necromancer upgrades. But um, it's just one aspect of undead is that is not currently used right now that I think could use a small buff, and
Right.
that would excite undead players.
Okay. There is an item change where I have a very strong opinion on, and that's the circlet. So,
Hmm.
whether the stats are correct or not, should Warcraft players be able to toggle items? Is that a thing that you see happen in Warcraft 3 from a design perspective?
So from a design perspective, I think let's not talk about the circlet for now. Even
Okay.
from like just a base Warcraft 3 design perspective, I think toggling I or the item system in Warcraft 3 is kind of the most unintuitive and frustrating aspect of Warcraft 3 to interact with, because you have to left click an item, you have to click an item on the ground, you have to know how to move items around, and that's important with right click. You have to know how to pass items, and because of the pathfinding in Warcraft 3, passing items can be very difficult. Um, there's just a lot that is very unapproachable for the average player. So even at a baseline in Warcraft 3, I feel like the item system is very clumsy. But then when we add in toggling with the circlets, it adds an extra layer to that. Um, it adds a layer of like I have to click this in order to do something with it, and especially for an item that is droppable from creeps, I think that is especially taxing on players because the ideal gameplay is as soon as you pick it up, you toggle it to the correct mode because you want to get that extra mana regen ASAP, or you want that extra HP if you're running away from something, or you want that extra HP regeneration. Um, so the gameplay around that is really unintuitive. So if you compare that to DotA, for instance, right? Um, when you buy a circlet or a treads, you're often safely at home in an item shop, and you have like 20, 30 seconds while you're traveling to your lane, during which you're like, you can kind of twiddle your thumbs and like toggle your circlet willy-nilly. And that's like, and that is acceptable because you are only controlling one hero and you have all this idle time compared to in an RTS game where you have to manage 20 things at once, and 1/100th of the things you have to manage is your circlet.
Yeah, that was also kind of my point. In Dota, it's just one hero and one item. In Warcraft, it's three heroes. You can pass the item. You got it multiple times. You have to change every single one. There's funny bugs where you can stack up to infinite strength on the hero, but then he has minus agility. Yeah, it was fun to play around with, but I think that is a failed experiment as well. Is there anything else with items that comes to your mind except how clunky the entire system is?
Um, I guess like there is like the RNG aspect of it. You're talking about overall, right?
Overall, yeah.
Just in Warcraft. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think
I think the R
we could talk about specific items here and the changes, but I don't think that's too interesting.
Yeah, I think the RNG aspect of the items is something that is kind of just part of Warcraft right now.
Yes.
And I think RNG can belong in a competitive game. And I think it does make some competitive games better. My philosophy with RNG is that you always want to make players feel like they have a meaningful decision after the RNG happens. Um, so, for example, right now in Warcraft 3, you get like boots of agility +3 as the Archmage, and you feel really bad. And in the past, like you couldn't do too much with it, but a change I really liked that happened fairly recently is that because the resale price increased, the decision to sell the item is much more interesting. Like before, I think in the past when items sold for 50%, you would almost always keep like even the really bad items. But now you often see players creeping their first hero, they expand, they pick up like what's like the what's a bad item? Like maybe a parrot pat, right? Parrot, how do you pronounce that? The plus HP item.
Yeah,
And
Periap.
parry up. And like some situations, it's actually an interesting decision on the player as to whether you sell it or not. And it's not obvious to the player. And I think those are the kind of decisions where like it makes the player feel smart and it allows the player to have agency and react to the RNG involved. So I think I don't personally have great ideas of how to improve that system overall, but I think that was a really smart change and a really cool change that helped move the needle in that direction to give players feel like they have more responsibility and more agency into the overall item drop system.
Some people suggested that you should be able to see what item is dropping or select the item that is dropping.
Do you mean like pick the item that is dropping?
Yes.
I think the problem with that is it adds another UI UX component to the game, and the UX UI component of the game is like again something that I criticize about Warcraft 3 and is my least favorite part about Warcraft 3. So to add extra complexity to that, I think would probably not the direction I would take. I know Remo is a big fan of the Discover mechanic in Hearthstone, and I think the Discover mechanic in Hearthstone is one of the best mechanics ever implemented in Hearthstone, and it's one of the best design ways to implement RNG, but it does not work in Warcraft 3 in my opinion.
All right. We're here for almost 2.5 hours, and it's basically your day off. I don't want to keep you up for any longer, but is there anything else you want to talk about? Is there anything else you want to share?
Not too much. It was great being on the show, and if I were to do plugs right now, I have to say I'm working on a cool new real-time Blizzard-style strategy game right now called Stormgate. You might have heard of it. Yes.
Really? Where can we learn? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, we can learn about it, of course, at playstormgate.com, or you can look up Stormgate on Steam and wishlist it. It'll help get our numbers up, and it'll really help us in order to get it out, get the next great real-time strategy game out to the world. In addition, just always tell your friends, spread the word about Stormgate, and I hope to be on more of these shows with you in the future, Neo. Once maybe you'll cover Stormgate a bit.
Well, if you invite me to the beta that is coming sometime, maybe I'll do that. The homepage is pretty great and easy to find. Go check it out. Stormgate. It is super exciting project by Frost Giant. We've been talking about this. There is cool content on the YouTube of Frost Giant as well. There's almost half an hour summary, basically, and interviews with the dev team. You're in there as well. I definitely recommend checking this out. And there's a lot to read and catch up if you guys have never heard about this. So go check it out. And as Monk already said, wishlist it. It's important to be working well on Steam once it's closer to release. All right. Then what's next for you between now and next year?
Now next year, I'm going to get some lunch right now. I am still on vacation, so planning a New Year's party. Neo, you're obviously welcome. It's going to be on the 31st, so if you can get a flight out, we're going to party.
All right, yeah, that's pretty easy, I guess. I'm going to check flights right now, leave the people at home with another Warcraft stream. Thank you so much for your time and all your knowledge and insight. It was I learned a lot here today. Thank you, mate.
Yeah, great to be here. See ya, Warcraft community.
Mr. Monk, I still want merchandise. Santa didn't bring it this Christmas. Thank you, community, for all the subs. This is, of course, going to go up on YouTube, so spread the word, share the link, send some love to Mr. Monk, and we'll see each other tomorrow at noon for Show Cup, and we got 120 versus Infi, and this is gonna be insane. So tune in at noon Central European time. Bye-bye.